I am really grateful that we're joined this morning by Paige Evans. Paige Evans, you should all know, is, and I don't like to use past ICWA fellow, once an ICWA fellow, always an ICWA fellow who was herself in Cuba, and she'll tell us a little bit about that from 1998 to 2000. And currently, as those of you who have watched the ICWA video know, Paige is Artistic Director of LCT3 at Lincoln Center in New York. As she can explain, that this is the space for new playwrights at Lincoln Center. She's a playwright and former literary manager of the Manhattan Theater Club in New York. And Paige earned her BA in History and Literature from Harvard. And Paige, thank you very much for being here with us.
Thanks. I'm so pleased to be here and to be moderating this panel on a different dimension of U.S.-Cuba relations and the potential changes in the areas of the arts, culture, the environment, and the law between U.S. and Cuba. As Edward mentioned, I returned from my ICWA fellowship 15 years ago. I was there from 1998 to 2000, and I was studying the performing arts, both the African influences and the European influences in the performing arts in Cuba. Though I come from a theater background, I was mostly studying dance and music because those were really the foremost performing arts in Cuba, and there's a wonderful variety of them there. I was there at the tail end of the Periodo Especial, the special period, which was a very difficult time economically and just for Cuban people and society as a whole after the withdrawal of the Soviet subsidies. And when I returned to the United States, I moved to Miami and lived there for a year, and I got to Miami 4 days before Elian Gonzalez did. So it was a very volatile time in U.S.-Cuba relations, and I really experienced that firsthand, as well as the devastating effects of the embargo when I was in Cuba on the Cuban people. So it was a really fascinating experience and a transformative one. And my experiences and the insights that I gained during my ICWA fellowship really have continued to play a real role in my day-to-day life and in my work as Artistic Director of LCT3 at Lincoln Center Theater. So I'm very grateful to ICWA for having given me that experience and opportunity. With my memories of Cuba in mind, I'm also very pleased to be moderating this panel and to be introducing my fellow panelists. And I'm very excited to hear about their impressions on more contemporary Cuba in these different areas of the arts, culture, the law, and environment. So I will introduce each of the people on the panel now. Alexandra P. Gelbard is an expert on Cuban music and culture, with particular emphasis on its African origins and influences. She's completing her PhD in sociology at Michigan State University this year. Kasara E. Davidson, Esquire, is a corporate attorney and a social justice engineer with a range of experience in and on Cuba, including on the nexus between law and cultural interactions between the U.S. and Cuba. This past March, Kasara presented a paper in Havana on changes in the provision of legal services and new forms of labor organization to the Association of American Jurists and the Association of Latin American Labor Lawyers. And Ximena Escovar-Fadul is a marine scientist with a broad experience in fisheries research and ocean management. She plays a key hands-on role within the organization and with the organization Ocean Doctor and its Cuba Conservancy program on the island. Ximena earned her master's degree in environmental studies from the University of Pennsylvania and her undergraduate degree in marine science at the Universidad de los Andes in Bogota, Colombia. Each panelist will speak for about 10 minutes on their various areas of expertise, and then we'll field questions from you. Thank you. Alexandra?
Good morning, everyone. So today I'm going to talk about the role of cultural exchange spaces and people-to-people interactions in the process of normalizing relations between the U.S. and Cuba. I have been working in Cuba for the last 13 years. I pride myself as a scholar to have deep community relationships, and that's why I can dare to call myself an expert. I think anyone who has spent truly significant amount of time in Cuba and in community knows that the more time you spend in Cuba, the more you get to know Cuba, the less you know about Cuba. Things are always changing in Cuba. The manifestations of their culture, social order, civil society, structural systems, I think, really can illuminate a more holistic approach to how to go about being a human social order, and that's the perspective that I come from. I center the eastern part of the island, and as well as the African-descended populations in my scholarship, and will be doing so as well in this presentation. Part of what I'm going to be talking about today is kind of the results of my dissertation fieldwork that ended in 2013, that shifted away from my original research and ended up looking at more of what I call the tourification of Cuba's cultural products. By that I mean the exotification as well as the tourist entity that these cultural products have become. These cultural products that are deeply rooted in community, have a specific social function to community, and as a result of this process of Cuba uplifting their tourism to be their primary GDP, it has had a somewhat detrimental effect on at least the cultural manifestation I study, which is conga. But today, I'm going to first contextualize how these cultural forms came to be. Inside of, when you talk about popular culture and popular music especially, it usually comes from a cultural, religious, spiritual entity that has extricated the religiosity out of it, and therefore extricated a consciousness of being. A lot of these cultural manifestations we've seen in Cuba arise from the African-descended population who engaged in them in order to actualize their self-liberation under conditions of enslavement and then racial oppression. So this kind of consciousness at the forefront, I believe, is very important to how we can find a balance as we enter this new realm of Cuba's cultural position in the larger globe. So to understand Cuban culture, we have to understand the Cuban social formation process. How did Cuba become Cuba? Well, the identity of being Cuban embraces this multi-ethnic national identity. There's a deep tie to the land space. There's a cognizance that there is a mixture of Spanish, African, multiple African ethnicities, even more extensive than what I have here, indigenous, who were there on the island before Christopher Columbus came, as well as Chinese. And then there's a small population of Yucatan indigenous people who were also brought at the same time with the Chinese in the 1930s. The process of transculturation is an essential concept to understanding Cuban culture. It's defined as the mixed clash grappling, the negotiation of people with multiple knowledge bases, multiple worldviews inside of a shared space that is stratified. And these produce distinctive formations that we know as culture, religion, education throughout the world. In the African diaspora particularly, there are a lot of parallels that go across different land spaces because of the knowledge bases that were brought. Everyone had similar knowledge, it's just in those particular spaces things manifested a little bit differently. But this concept comes from Cuba and is upheld as the root essence of Cuban cultural production. So none of these, the beautiful music that, such as we heard last night, the rumba, would have happened without cabildos. Cabildos are an organizational entity that descends from Seville in 1392 and was a space for those populations that weren't granted full citizenship and were allowed mutual aid for economic purposes, but also for maintaining their sociocultural behaviors, rituals, spirituality, and what we know as religion. What we saw last night in terms of the rumba, that is a direct descendant from the cabildos. Now, I'm skipping ahead a little bit. In part of the very extensive history that I'm not sure was, that's not typically out there in what we know about Cuba, the relationship to the US and Cuban culture usually starts contemporarily or after the revolution. But really, the US intervention in Cuba's independence movement in 1898 initiated a more concrete way of how Cuba began, and the US began to incorporate each of their social structures, cultural particulars, into their respective cultures. So the idea of cultural exchange between US and Cuba has been going on for many, many years. And actually starts in 1802 when Thomas Jefferson declares that if the US deems it so, they will invade Cuba if necessary. That, of course, wasn't enacted until 1898, and then 1902 it was solidified into our law with the Platt Amendment. But the US and Cuba have always, well, through the white Creole elite, have been considering an annexationist relationship. That the Cuban Revolution, as we know it, was in direct opposition to that project. And that's part of resituating and reconceptualizing the history as we know it. But when the US does come into Cuba in 1898 and essentially influences the Cuban land space until 1959, there's the infiltration of US industrialization onto the island, as well as US concepts of social relationships, such as Jim Crow. This causes segregation in terms of cultural spaces, and including the segregation of carnival, where white Cubans had carnival in January when it was cooler, black Cubans or darker-skinned Cubans had carnival in July, where it's insufferably hot. But this also relationship starts to propagate the exchange between the US and Cuba in terms of, for example, big band jazz, the presence of Desi Arnaz, and there's a wonderful little anecdote that I have about that if someone would like to ask me during the question and answer, et cetera. So, now Cuban popular culture is a space where the religiosity, the spirituality of these African-inspired Cuban religious practices can be articulated, but it's also a space where people can just have fun, sing songs, use it as a space to critique the government in creative ways. Use it as a space to enact cleansing rituals with the leaves, as you see, and another gentleman dressed up as one of the spiritual entities of the Yoruba-based practice, also known as Santeria. And these are just some visual images of what Cuban popular culture, and conga specifically, looks like in community and for community. So Cuba's contact and the tourism effect. I've been working in Cuba since 2002, which is a nice pickup from Paige Evans, because although you said it was the end of the special period, the Cubans would say that the special period is still there. Over the last 13 years, I have seen steady improvement in terms of the material conditions of Cuba. Little things like having hair dye or being able to have tattoos, having the supermarket shelves stocked with clothing items, and more food. It has been steadily increasing. I would not consider Cuba a third world country in any way, shape, or form. I've seen third world countries, and Cuba does not have the same kind of issues that other spaces that are completely impoverished do. So the tourism relationship has kind of amplified those dichotomies as well. You hear a lot of Cubans saying, oh, you know, we're so poor, we're a third world country, and at the same time, the streets are clean. There's not open raw sewage rolling through the streets, like I saw in places like Indonesia, for example. And there's been this steady development of Cuba's tourism entity since at least 2002, when I've been going. This visual you see is a group of French that come every year, led by a gentleman who's from France and married to a Cuban woman. And because of the relationship between Eastern Cuba specifically and the Haitian Revolution, during the Haitian Revolution in 1791, just prior to, a lot of the French plantation owners literally picked up and moved their plantations, their coffee plantations, to Eastern Cuba, bringing with them their enslaved Africans. And that Haitian influence and the Haitian African influence upon Cuba cultural formation has been absolutely essential to that Cuban identity. But they come and they give this group every year, and they perform during Carnival. And there's the French have this sense of blood tie to Cuba, since their ancestors have that relationship as well. In 2008, 2011, I arrived in the country to find Havana Tour. Havana Tour is Cuba's main tourism company, and they had begun to commodify or put out advertisements for the conga, which is this community-based music group music genre that I study. As you can see, this was brand new. The conga has a reputation because it's formed by African descendants and phenotypically dark-skinned people for being, quote, dangerous. And they always say to me, being a white woman, oh, why do you want to go with those brutes down in the conga? Isn't it dangerous? You know, you should stay up here with us. Those kind of racialized comments. So to see this entity now commercialized in the neighborhood in which it is, which is a historically African-descended neighborhood and physically dark-skinned, now have a tourism project to promote tourism to the neighborhood has been a fascinating research line for me, but also serves as a model for how Cuba is approaching tourism and to uphold their GDP. So part of the detrimental impacts of this is that with a focus more on tourism and less of a focus on the community-based function that these music genres have, there's been subsequently a generational disconnection, lesser community social cohesion, and, like I said, the tourification of these cultural products. This is a visual of an Italian gentleman who's married to a Cuban woman and comes back and forth and now sings religious songs in the Congo tradition, as well as rumba. And you can see him standing out very brightly from everyone else. So what is the impact of these potential cultural exchanges? Cultural exchange, like I said, is not new. In the last 20 years or so, there's been academic musical exchanges. There have been consistent programs. Just a couple months ago, the Santiago de Cuba Dance All-Stars came to Washington, D.C., which was one of the first times that a Cuban group has actually come to the United States, rather than people from the United States just going to Cuba. That's been a big issue with the Cubans, saying, we just want to get out and see the world too. Why should we be stifled in a fishbowl or in a hole? We want to get out, but we also want to come back home to our country. So why not facilitate that exchange? Part of the potential impact could be the attraction of that essence that happens in music when you hear the drums, what Durkheim calls emotional effervescence. That feeling you can't quite get a grip on, but when the music takes you, you feel those chills, or however it's expressed. It also can show us the parallels of human social formation. So for example, when I live in Baltimore, and when I'm in Baltimore and I see the Araber carts going out through the streets and singing, I think of the Cuban pregoneros, using carts to disperse and sell fruits and vegetables. It also facilitates casual conversation and genuine human relationships. I think we can sit up on our soapboxes and talk politics all day, but when it comes down to it, if we don't have those real human connections, those true relationships, it doesn't do us any good. I think that's the way to really bridge across those ideological and political lines. That also helps illuminate the realities of our respective worlds. Cuba only getting media images from Miami in terms of our popular culture in the United States, they have a very false perception of what the United States is about. They don't appreciate that you have to pay a water bill, you have to pay rent, you don't get free medical care, you don't get free education. The streets can be dangerous, that there are guns out there. They know nothing about that. It can also produce new musical forms, like we saw in the 1950s and onward. I mean, look what we can do with Cuban percussion, and imagine what they can do with our musical forms here. I mean, the possibilities are phenomenal. I think this can also bring economic benefit to artist communities and communities that share, that are really on a self-organization level right now. We talk a lot about community sustainability and ground level. There's a whole farm-to-table movement. Well, this kind of community-oriented perspective really can benefit these struggling artists, both here and across the water into Cuba economically. It also brings commonality. But all of it, I contend, has to be done with a respect of the consciousness and origin that are imbued within these cultural products. The process of cultural appropriation stays in line with racism. And if we don't start to break out of that pattern, we're just going to keep repeating the same cycles over and over again. And then finally, another possibility are transnational community partnerships across the African diaspora. One of my Cuban colleagues came on a speaking tour in the US, and I showed him the Living Well in Baltimore, which is an organization I'm affiliated with, and explained to him what it was about. And he said, oh yeah, this is a cabildo, referring to the Cuban concept of a mutual aid social organization. So to build partnerships across that can benefit all parties on that kind of community level. So these cultural exchanges, like I said, have already started, not just through the academic musical exchange, but the most recent being the Minnesota Orchestra's presence in Havana this past couple weeks. There's some really great articles on it on this new website called Cuba Counterpoints. CubaCounterpoint.org, I believe. And they are having, it's public scholarship about a change in Cuba. So you get to hear from the Cuban scholarly perspective in English, which is very beneficial. And they've been putting up a lot of articles about what this says about diplomacy. But these, like I said, these exchanges have already happened. These are some visual images from the Cuban dance scene here in Washington, D.C. You can see, actually, Adrian Valdivia up here, the head of DC Casineros, was a featured dancer last night. All right, thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. I'm very honored to be here representing Cuban scientists and representing Ocean Doctor, as well as talking to you about environment in Cuba. It is an aspect that we don't always think about, and Ocean Doctor has been working in Cuba for 15 years, and I want to show you the beauty of Cuba, as well as represent the importance of having relations between US and Cuba for marine conservation. So first of all, I want to tell you what Ocean Doctor does. We are a nonprofit organization based in DC. We work with Cuba on different aspects. These are the aspects that we are working right now. So over 95% of our work is in Cuba right now, and even more after the announcement last December. Resilience, we work in resilience because Cuba has a very healthy marine ecosystem, and it brought a very interesting ecosystem for scientists to study it because it doesn't have as much local threats as other places in the Caribbean. So resilience is the capacity of the environment to get back to its original stage after a natural disaster. So think about Cuba as being isolated for some reason, the communism, or because they have very good environmental law that we can discuss about that. But it becomes an ecosystem that is very interesting to study because they don't have those local threats, such as coastal development or pollution. So resilience, right now, for example, in August, we are going to have some scientists from the United States coming to Cuba to work with Cuban scientists on resilience projects and use Cuba's environment as a biological model to study other places in the Caribbean that we know that are very affected. We are also working on environmental economics, and environmental economics is to put a market value to marine resources, and like that we can communicate to politics and say, this is how much a shark costs in the water, and this is how much a shark costs in your plate. So with that tool, it's much easier to talk to politics about why we should conserve this area or why we should extend this marine protected area. We are working in this project with scientists from University of Santa Barbara, from University of Boulder, Colorado, WRI in DC. There are scientific, American scientists, and we're working as well with some scientists in Cuba. So we held our workshop on environmental economics last September, before we knew the announcement was coming. And we are successfully having our next workshop in San Francisco next September, where Cuban scientists are gonna come and we are gonna continue this work. We are also working a little bit with the community. Underwater idea for Cubans is a little bit far. What I mean with this is Cubans cannot go underwater that much if they are not working as a dive master or an instructor, or if they are not marine biologists. So there's a huge problem because underwater or snorkeling or these tourism activities help a lot for conservationists because they are aware of what they have. But it's very tricky for Cubans to be on boats. It's very tricky for Cubans to be underwater. So it's impossible for them, sometimes it's impossible for them to see what they have, the beauty they have underwater. So we are planning our, the very first environmental film festival in 2016 in Cuba, where we're gonna bring underwater images to Cubans in Havana, and we're working with local NGOs there to bring them to other places in Cuba. So this is a little bit of a broad perspective of what Ocean Doctor does in Cuba and what the Cuba Conservancy program is. There are other research developing, but we can talk more about it if you have questions, such as, for example, tourism, that we were talking with Edward about it. We are, right now, after the announcement, we are developing some research on tourism and how to prevent that the tourism is harmful for the environment in Cuba. We can talk more about it in the questions. But I always like to start with this image, and on your left, you're gonna see a map that there are sea turtles that are tagged in Cuba. And this map shows the connectivity of the Caribbean and how one turtle, for example, Cuba has the largest loggerhead a nesting area in the Caribbean. So one turtle that nests in Cuba will go to Florida, will go to Mexico. So this is an example to show you that we cannot isolate countries, and we have to manage them all together in marine resources and in other subjects as well. And this one is very interesting, and it's from one of our colleagues that we work in Cuba, and there are larvae of snapper. And what they found with this research is that larvae that are originated in Cuba, they end up in the Atlantic Ocean, where the snapper fisheries is pretty important. So this is to say that Americans have to care about Cuban's ocean as well, because at the end, it's gonna be our fisheries as well. Everything is connected. And I have more examples with manatees and with sharks. All there are migratory species that share between oceans. And sometimes neighbors don't get along, but we need to work together in order to conserve our oceans. So that's one of the fundamentals of Ocean Doctor. We need to work together, and that's why we do this exchange on workshops and research. We like to show these images. This is Miami, and this is an image record on the same place in the Florida Keys. So it's 1975, 1985, 2004, and 2014. And okay, you cannot see it because the black thing, but 2014 is completely, this was a community of Elcon coral. It's a very important coral for reef ecosystem and structure, and it's gone. Is gone from 1975 to 2014. Corals are disappearing fast, very fast, because local threats as overfishing and pollution, but also because climate change. And coastal development has a huge implication on this. So I want to show you this because we don't want this to become Cuba, and that's what Ocean Doctor is working on. So to give you a little bit of a perspective of Cuba in the Caribbean and to teach you a little bit about coral reefs in the Caribbean, especially for Jessica's viaje, this is the Caribbean, and the Caribbean has 7% of coral reefs in the world. It's very important. So the purple areas are where you find coral reefs in the Caribbean. And however, because coastal development, pollution, overfishing, this is a study from Jeremy Jackson, that is a very big scientist of coral reefs, discovered that we have lost 50% of our coral reefs since 1970. And he has some, he explains some local threats and global threats, but the conclusion is that if we don't change this in 20 years, they are gonna be all gone. So I wanted to, this also is a study from WRI that shows how coral reefs are threatened by human activities. And Cuba has some red there, and that's because Cuba has a lot of successes, but they struggled as well. You know, there is lack of enforcement, there is overfishing, there are other struggles on environment, on threats for the environment. But I'm going to talk to you about the successes of Cuba because for one reason or the other, it could be the embargo or the good law that they have in place. They have a lot of successes on environmental issues, especially in the oceans. So it's very meaningful because 13% of coral reefs in the Caribbean are found in Cuba. There is one country that has more, and it's Bahamas, with 17%. But so we have to think that Cuba is an important country based on coral reefs. Why coral reefs are important? Coral reefs are the tropical forest of the oceans, and they are the base of all fisheries and economy. They are also very important for coastal protection. They are a barrier that will stop waves for coastal protection in all those islands. So Cuba has 40% of Cuba's microfauna is endemic, has the biggest marine protected area in the Caribbean. This is Gardens of the Queen. We do work there. It's 1,000 square kilometers, and it was established in 1996. 20 years of successful MPA. Is one of the most pristine areas in the Caribbean. 55% of endemic species in the Caribbean are found in Cuba, and then 95% of Cuba's coast is covered by coral reef or has presence of coral reef, which is very important, for example, for hurricanes prevention and for biodiversity. And then mangroves in Cuba represent 1/5 of Cuba's forest. And mangroves are also important for coastal protection, as well as they are nursery areas for hundreds of species in the ocean. Cuba has a very strong environmental law. Law 81 was established in 1997 and has very important points, as you can see there, such as education, management. That has a management national fund. It's not very clear how the National Fund for Conservation works. As in the last panel they were saying, those things are not public, but at least they have one. And then one interesting point on this is that the main goal is that 25% of the area, they wanted to protect 25% of Cuba's area. And further in the presentation, I'm going to show you, and I'm going to compare to other countries, and you're going to see that this is huge to protect 25% of the area. I also brought this law 212 that is about coastal management, because this law was established in 2000, and what it says is that they are banning the construction within 40 meters of the coastal line. So, and they are doing that especially for prevention for climate change and sea level rise. So if you have a house close to the 40 meters, there are studies that say that in 20 years are going to be gone. So not only they cannot construct within 40 meters of the coastal line, they are demolishing houses that are 40 meters from the coastal line, so which is very interesting. Cubans believe in climate change. So some successes to show you here with numbers, because we're scientists, so I have to bring some numbers. So in the top chart, you can see that 20% of Cuba is protected now, while around 17% is protected inland, and approximately 25% of its ocean is protected. And when you compare it to, hold on. I need to, yes, okay, here we go. Okay, it doesn't matter, let's do it like this. But I want to show you that when you compare it with US and the world only has 2.1% of marine protected areas, while Cuba has 25%. The US has 16.32%, while Cuba has 25%, and it's an island, you know? And then it's land protected area here. So it's huge, and this is a huge achievement that Cubans should feel proud of, and I feel proud of them as well. They have a very complicated system of protected areas. Right now they have around 253 protected areas, and they have a centralized system and different agencies. I can go more in detail if you want, if you have questions about it, but I just want to say that they have a very complicated and effective system in some ways of protected areas. what everyone is worried about, and is tourism. This is data from the Ministry of Tourism in Cuba, that from 1909 and 2010, you can see is the blue line how many visitors Cuba has had, and we just see exponential growth here. And now with the announcement, I don't have data. I wish I had it, but for sure it's much more, and it's increasing much more. Another data that I wanted to show you is the contribution of tourism to the tourism economy, to the GDP. And this is data from 2002, but it's only in Cuba, it's only the 11%. And now should be much more, but it's going to increase even more. But when we compare with countries such as Aruba or Bahamas, that they are around 47%. So my point here is that Cuba's contribution from tourism to the GDP is going to increase much more in these years. But we need to work in order that this contribution is in a sustainable way, in a long-term way, and they don't become other islands in the Caribbean or other places such as Cancun, where the community is completely isolated from the environment and from the tourist. And that's what Ocean Doctor is working in. So what are the risks? What are the risks of this tourism? So if you think about it, mainly our main focus on this subject is going to be mangroves, because coastal development happens where mangroves are. And it's very common for these countries to deforestate mangrove forests in order to build a Hilton on. So we are going to try to put the value of mangrove forests, and like that tell to the Cuban government, this is how much your mangroves are worth based on nursery areas, based on coastal protection. And we do that with bioeconomical models in collaboration with American scientists, American technology, and Cuban scientists, in order to make sure that Cubans make the right decision for their coastal protection and they don't build a hotel on it. Cubans have very strong environmental law. They have great scientists, and they have done it well until now, but they call it the avalanche, and we don't know what that will mean in an economy that has been struggling for the last years. The main challenges that Cuba's environment has is that Cuba's economy is changing very fast, and science goes very slow. Limited international perception, so most people in Cuba hasn't left the country yet, so they don't have that international perception of Cancun, Indonesia, Costa Rica, all this tourism, different types of tourism. Lack of funding for enforcement and administration, so I told you that they have 253 protected areas, but around 50% of these protected areas are not well administrated. So it's because lack of money. But what we can do is that tourism can fund these protected areas in order to conserve them. The investor agreements could be, okay, so when investors make agreements, they could subordinate environmental law right now. So that the environmental law is there, it doesn't mean much if an investor agreement will come and subordinate those environmental laws that are in place. And we have to keep that in mind, that the environmental law could be subordinated depending on the government interest. There is a lot of stiffness developing new initiatives such as environmental economics. It's a new subject. There is like 3 environmental economists in Cuba. It's a very stiff system, and then the bureaucracy and its centralized system, and there is very few NGOs in Cuba and very few public opinion. So I'm going to stop there, but I'm open to questions about these subjects. I hope I gave you a broad perspective of Cuba's environment.
Good morning. Just wanted to thank ICWA for allowing me to present, and I wanted to thank you all for listening to us today. I want to let's shake off what we think we know about Cuba, okay? Let's kind of like literally, let's move a little bit and get out what you think you know about Cuba, what you've heard before, and be open to Cuba talks a lot about contradictions. Be open to contradictory models, hearing things that you've heard today that might not fall in line with what you've heard before, and what you've heard before is true, and what you're hearing now is true. All of that exists in this very dynamic place. Best way to learn about it is go. I think everyone should just go. So I'm happy to have a captive audience of very influential and learned people. I'm excited for what you all will do with this information that you have, because again, the best way to understand Cuba and the best way for our nations to build the bridges that need to be built is through people-to-people connections. I'm very excited to see what we all do with this information that we're gaining. And a social justice engineer. And I think it's important for me to give you a little bit about my background, because again, these are kind of contradictory terms. You don't usually have a corporate attorney who's interested in bettering society, or at least that's what people think. And I'd like to kind of debunk that myth. My soapbox anthem is that if we continue to have the same people within economics and corporate law and urban development doing the same things, business executives, the same people doing the same things will get us the same results. If we have folks that traditionally shy away from those areas, those industries, capitalizing or leveraging their little bit of interest in them, they might find that they really like it, and that there's room and there's opportunity for change. So that's me. As a corporate attorney, I come from a family of business owners. I was a business consultant prior to becoming a corporate attorney. I worked for a large law firm in New York right after law school. I was a private equity mergers and acquisitions attorney. I say to certain crowds, the work that I did is the work that actually broke the world. Not funny. And then after I left my firm, I worked for a few startup companies, and now I have my own practice. Alrighty, so the concept of social justice, this is a term that was introduced to me while I was at law school, Howard University School of Law right here in DC. And this is kind of my definition over time and from my research. Social justice challenges our current methods of developing, aggregating, managing, and distributing wealth, resources, and opportunities and privileges, and aims to develop and implement more equitable, fair, compassionate, and participatory methods. So the idea here for me is that corporate attorneys, because of the information that we have access to, because of the skills that we're taught, are at we have an advantage to help to institutionalize ideas about social justice. As a social justice engineer, what I do from a legal and cultural perspective, I research, analyze, and present ideas regarding the evolution of the methods in which we develop, aggregate, manage, and distribute wealth and resources. And I'll tie that into why that has anything to do with Cuba in a moment. So my experience with Cuba, from about 2009 until 2015, I've been traveling as the only corporate attorney a part of a labor law conference, which was a very interesting experience. So that was my first introduction to the actual island. I also am recently researching my ancestral familial relationship with Cuba. My family is on my father's side is Creole from Louisiana. My grandmother would talk about her grandmother who didn't speak English, who was from Cuba, and that was just something that I never pursued. Recently, I've gone on to kind of look into that, and it's been a very interesting and healthy experience while I'm also learning about Cuba academically and professionally. I've also recently started a business that deals with the people-to-people side of interaction with Cuba. We organize events and programs in Cuba to bring United States citizens over, as well as events and programs here to help people understand the dynamics. So, law and culture, the topic that I'm here to talk about. So I'll address why law and culture. I'll address what is culture, what's the relationship between law and culture that I think is, what is the actual relationship between law and culture, and then why is that relationship important? Underneath why that relationship is important is understanding the benefit of the relationship to the United States, the benefit of the relationship between law and culture. People don't usually think about those things having anything to do with each other. And also what the benefit of understanding that relationship is to what the benefit of that is to understanding the US-Cuba relationship. So culture is a lot of different things. We can find a lot of different definitions. I liked this one. It was short and sweet. Let's keep it simple. Culture is that complex whole that includes language, belief, art, morals, law, custom, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by a human being as a member of society. So everything. And the idea here is that, and this goes into why law and culture. The idea here is that law codifies our cultural understandings, our cultural mores. Law is a representation of what we find to be important. Law is a representation of how we would like people to act in society, how we don't want people to act in society, what we'd like to punish, what we would like to reward. All of those things are cultural aspects that get codified through our laws that then are reacted to by society, pushed against or followed, a mixture of both usually. And it's this back and forth dance of law and culture. I realized as a corporate attorney that I'd spent much of my existence dealing with business entities. I was a business consultant prior to going to law school. And so I had dealt with business entities from cradle to grave. I knew how to marry them, I knew how to start them, I knew how to divorce them and how to split the assets among them. I knew all about all of their property. And it came to me that I had this relationship with this cultural institution that runs so much of our lives, our business entities, the idea of the corporation, the idea of how we manage our wealth in society is codified within our corporate and business law. So I decided it was kind of cool. I thought it was interesting. When I say it to people, they're like, oh, I hadn't thought about it that way. So then I realized I was onto something that maybe people realize when I say it, but it's not necessarily something that they're talking about. So I've kind of talked about the idea that law and culture are inextricably linked. That's the relationship. Culture assists in the creation of laws and the construction of legal systems by cultivating and informing the principles that give these phenomena weight and authority. Laws are one manner in which a society seeks to understand itself, a way for a society to express its ethics, values, standards, and ideals, an attempt to address the common tensions that exist among the various societal interests, the individual, the community, and the state. Our laws are a cultural product created to legitimate our prerogatives and paradigms, and to codify our norms and worldviews, and ordering of the world. Why is it important? It's important because I believe in civic engagement, and we're in DC, and so I assume that most of us in this room believe in civic engagement. And being in DC, we can forget that not all of the United States, not all citizens participate in the workings of their national or local governments the way we do here in DC. Civic engagement is the cornerstone of our republic, of our democracy. It's a quote from Tocqueville. It is indeed difficult to imagine how men who have entirely renounced the habit of managing their own affairs could be successful in choosing who ought to lead them. It is impossible to believe that a liberal, energetic, and wise government can ever emerge from a ballot of a nation of servants. And so I don't believe that we are there, but the idea is that if we become so apathetic, if we don't participate, if we don't understand and appreciate the importance of civic engagement, then we're handing over our republic, we're handing over our democracy. The point here, how this ties in, is that I want to use my relationship and my expertise with the law to encourage people to understand that the legal system is not outside of your everyday experience. You're constantly interacting with your legal system. You're constantly engaging that part of the world, and so it makes sense to be civically engaged. So that's how law and culture becomes important for the U.S. or any nation. As far as why this idea is important to U.S. and Cuba, the way in which we think about Cuba and the way in which Cuba thinks about us are a direct result of the laws that have been in place for 50 years. Cubans, as Alexandra pointed out, they have a perspective of what it means to be a capitalist, what it means to live in a capitalist society. We never rest. We don't take any vacation days. The idea that that you have to pay for water, the idea that you have to pay for education, all of these things are born of the fact that we have legislation that created an embargo. All of these things are born of the legislation that exists in Cuba as propaganda about the United States. It's a back and forth. It's a back and forth thing. So one example of how we can use this idea of law and culture and relationship of people is through entrepreneurs. So entrepreneurship is a cultural phenomenon. There is culture to entrepreneurship. There are skills, there are skill sets and a way of being and a way of doing things that successful entrepreneurs in the United States and elsewhere, but in the United States, there's a way of being. Cuba, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, Cuba is going through what they call an updating of their socialist model. And it's important to note that they, the government, the people, are very clear that they are not abandoning socialism. Socialism and the things that they've won through the socialist project are very important to them. They want to bring in pieces of capitalism, pieces of a free market society to better their lives. So they're, because of the new labor code, and I believe it was 2013, the new labor code that was enacted in 2013 has given more opportunity for entrepreneurs or for the self-employed. In Cuba, that's called the cuentapropistas, or the empresarios, which is entrepreneurs. So updating the Cuban economic model, which will allow US entrepreneurs and Cuban entrepreneurs to begin to work together and learn from each other, learn best practices, learn things that that shouldn't happen. The ability to do this is a result of the laws, the changing of the laws. So we talked about this a little bit earlier as well. Even prior to December 17th, Cuba was moving toward expanding their economic model. 2011, they had the economic guidelines, which is a set of economic reforms and goals. 2013 was the new labor code, and that was adopted to replace the outdated labor code from 1985. And just so that you understand, the labor code, because most people were employed by the government, the labor code is a very extensive piece of legislation. And then there's also the foreign investment law, which was enacted March 2014, which deals with foreign direct investment. Cuban entrepreneurs, cuentapropistas, came into effect really kind of during the special period, in reaction to the fall of the Berlin Wall, the ending of the Soviet Union, and therefore the ending of the subsidies and the relationship that Cuba had with USSR. They had to make some changes. And so during that time, even that early, the Cuban government was allowing certain self-employed models. 2013, I think there's a list of 201 now self-employment models that Cubans can use, and recently, 2010 or 11, there was a redeployment. There's a redeployment process of state workers into the private sector, and so this entrepreneurship or self-employment area is very important, and that's why it's such a wonderful area for there to be cultural exchange and people-to-people exchange, because Cubans, although they are industrious and they make things happen out of whatever situation they have, they don't necessarily have the same relationship with being an entrepreneur, with running your own business. So this is an opportunity for entrepreneurs in the United States to work with, and not just assist Cubans in doing something better for themselves, but to work with Cubans to assist them with learning what they need to learn, and in turn, we'd be surprised what we might learn. Because they have a socialist foundation, they're going to approach their business models with particular emphasis. And that emphasis is something that you find now that entrepreneurs and companies are looking for. The idea that the bottom line is not the only bottom line, that there can be multiple reasons for the existence of a business, that we should have businesses that are sustainable and that don't wreak havoc, on our environment. And because of Cuba's positioning, these are things they are naturally going to take into consideration when they're putting together their business. They naturally can take into consideration when they're putting together their business models. And so there's that back and forth relationship. I do think it's important to note, though, that the cuenta propista is a term of art that came about because the license is for trabajadores por cuenta propia, which literally means workers by account own, so workers for own account, meaning you're not working for the government. You're self-employed. And I've recently heard that there are those who have started their own businesses who don't want to be called cuenta propista because that is a term that that sets it in direct relationship to, like, you're not working for the government, sets in direct relationship to something prior. They'd rather be called entrepreneurs. So this is kind of the end of my presentation. Something that that was said, that Timothy Reeser said yesterday, was about the train has already left the station and there's no way we can get it back. You can't unring a bell, you can't uncrack an egg. The momentum is there, and so even though people not everybody's on the same side, change has started, and it's really about how we shape that change. Change is the one constant of the universe, is change, and so you can't really stop it, but you can participate, you can shape it. So this is a quote from one of my favorite science fiction authors, Octavia Butler. I asked what was the most powerful force I could think of, what one thing could not stop no matter how hard we tried. The answer I came up with after some thought was change. The universe, the ongoing reality is change. We can do a lot of things to influence the ongoing process of change. We can focus them, alter their speed or impact. In general, we can shape change, and that's my emphasis, but we can't stop it, no matter how hard we try. And so this is the direction that we're going. We can't stop it. We need all types of people to be a part of shaping this change so that both sides of this equation, Cubans and those us in the United States, benefit from this new relationship, this wealth of information. Thank you again, and I'm excited to hear questions. This is my contact information if anyone wants it.
Thank you, Kasara. So it was wonderful to hear from all of our panelists, and now we'll open up the discussion to your questions. Yes.
About this from the first panel, but does Russia now have any interest or influence in Cuba?
Not even when I was there, from 1998 to 2000. Really the Russian role in Cuba, I think, ended. I mean, there's some presence. There is an embassy which you can see from anywhere in Havana, but I don't think, after the withdrawal of Soviet subsidies, I don't think so.
And there's debt that Cuba has with Russia, and I believe there was recently a renegotiation of that debt so that it's not as much as it was. But in terms of, prior to the special period, Cuba, when you're dealing with bullies, right? Like the embargo is kind of a bullying tactic. So when you're dealing with bullies, what do? You get protection from the bigger bully, and that's essentially what Cuba did. They went to Russia. They did it within the Cold War context, so it meant so much more than an island nation who was having a revolution just trying to protect themselves. It meant you were choosing a side in a war that had a lot of ideology. So there was big influence then. It's not the same, at least from my experience.
Do they still have a fine ballet company?
Yes, they do.
Alicia Alonso.
So that's good. They still.
Although that type of what Euro-Western culture would call, quote, high culture, and then as a dichotomy limit like African constructed culture as, quote, folklore, that, quote, high culture is really only found in Havana, and while it is broadcast on TV, people in the outer provinces definitely talk about how Havana has this kind of insular monopoly on cultural behaviors.
Other questions?
Gary Hartshorn, former fellow for Ximena. Is coastline precisely defined in the new marine law, and if so, what is it? Because it makes a huge difference whether it's mean high tide, mean low tide, mean tide.
You mean for the law 212?
Yes, no construction within 40 meters of the coastline. What's coastline?
Yeah, I don't know that answer exactly what is the coastline for that law, but it will be interesting to know. I think normally in environmental law for law of the sea is the lowest mark in the water in high tide, in low tide. That's the lowest mark. So it's the other way. High tide and low tide. So for example, for the construction will be the high tide, the highest mark. But for example, for ocean law, normally, for example, okay, so in international law for the oceans, they count the exclusive economic zone from the lowest mark tide 200 miles. So because we are looking at it from the land, so it will be the highest, that's my guess, the highest mark tide 40 meters, but I don't know by head that. But it makes a huge difference, I agree.
Do we have other questions?
I really loved all three presentations. I have no knowledge at all of the environment, but I want to talk about the other two, the Afro-Cuban and the cultural engagement. My first trip to Cuba, I said before, was as an ICWA fellow, and when I came back, my fellowship was in El Salvador, and the maid who worked in our house had been a guerrilla. She came in from the mountains because she had a baby, and needed something to do in the city. So she, of course, idolized Cuba. She had a brother who was injured in the combat, and he was rehabilitated in Cuba. And being a member of the FMLN, they only knew Cuba as the bright sun shining over the future. And I was so worried about how I could talk her down from that euphoria, because I was very disillusioned when I went to Cuba, and I wanted to. So I remember the first thing I said to her was, "Well, Adela, there are no rich people. Everybody's poor in Cuba." And she sucked in her breath and she grinned and she said, "Wow, you mean everyone's like us?" And I realized, in El Salvador, when you live in a society where you're the natives, but you'll never own a car. You may never even own a farm, because everything's taken by these outsiders. To be in a country where everyone's like you and poor, not celebrated, is an amazing thing. Years later, I went back to Cuba, and I became friendly with a University of Havana professor whose cousin was the lead guitarist in a rock band that I used to manage in New York City. And that was the way I got to go to her home and talk to her. And she was pretty worldly. She was a PhD and had just come back from Mexico. And she said she went on a left-wing tour of Mexico City where they showed her all the billionaires' homes of people I routinely covered as a Forbes magazine and Wall Street Journal reporter. And she demanded to know, like, how can this be allowed? How can there be so many rich people? And I thought, that's funny, because when you go to Brazil, the reaction is, how can all this poverty be permitted? But their attitude was, in this world, who can permit such wealth? It's just not fair. So I think that's kind of the crossroads Cuba and the US are at, that Americans define themselves by what they're able to consume and how well their intake is of resources, and Cubans have resisted this for 50 years. But I have to add one other anecdote. When I last went to Cuba, we visited with a family whose casa particular I always stay in Vedado, and they were getting angrier and angrier because their daughter had been rejected at the University of Havana 5 years in a row. And she was an excellent student, but she was getting to be too old to apply. And at one point, the mother threw down grandma on the floor, and she said, "Look at this, 300 Vietnamese are coming next year to the University of Havana." And they see all their resources, all their opportunities being given away to outsiders. And the mother said something I'll never forget. She stroked her chin the way people do in Cuba, which is code for Fidel. And she said, él sabe que si da la gente algo, quieren más. You know, he knows if you give them anything, they want more, the people. And so I think that cult of poverty that Cuba rode that arc all those years, you know, it has very serious implications for how we'll go forward and how that will be untangled as the nations get, you know, more engaged together. It's not a question, it's just something I wanted to throw out.
If I can just respond for a second. In my experience in Cuba over the last 13 years, I've made a concerted effort, and the team I was working with made a concerted effort to be in community and with community. And it was one of the most technically impoverished communities in Cuba. But having, you know, been fortunate enough to have experience throughout the world, and having seen other impoverished communities, I will say that when you take a society that has used to material abundance, that's used to being able to buy fresh clothes like Cuba did for many centuries, and then into certainly parts of the revolution through the 80s, really up until the special period, and then all of a sudden that's ripped away and then kept away by the embargo regulations. It causes a material thirst. That's just human. I think part of what Cubans are going to face, and they don't realize it yet, is that the ability to have material items won't necessarily cure the kind of backpedaling to the capitalist days and the social problems that have emerged. Over the last 13 years, I've seen kind of a disillusion in the safety and walking down the street. People have been committing more acts of violence against each other for material items, breaking into houses. And so it's like you dangle a carrot in front of somebody, how do you expect them to respond? I think when we talk about poverty from a capitalist perspective, it's a very particular view. But from a Cuban perspective, they also value social solidarity and the society above the individual, because they understand that, you know, and this is sociology 101, humans run in groups. That's our biological nature. So they've embodied that in their social order. But I think it's just it's a tricky road to navigate when we come at it from a very particular worldview, and Cubans are coming at it from a very different worldview, and we're talking past each other, especially when it comes to that kind of materialism concept.
I would say when I was there too, there was beginning, because of the periodo especial, there was beginning to be more haves and have-nots in Cuba, and people who had family in the United States were more haves. They had material goods in their homes that other Cubans didn't have access to. And people talked about sort of longingly the good old days when everybody got enough from the government, from their monthly rations, that they didn't have this kind of divide, and that people shared more openly because of that. But then once it started becoming more stratified in terms of socioeconomic opportunities, there was more of a divide. And I think people in the government always were more haves in Cuba than the ordinary people. Yeah. So there's always been some stratification. It hasn't been completely equal, but I think it's gotten worse as it's gone along in terms of the different socioeconomic differences.
And that gets to kind of the ideology of Cuba as this equitable place, but at the same time, there's always been this underlying racial stratification. And even though the revolution proponed to erase all the racialization and stratification from that and propagate racial equality, a few key people in certain high-level places does not equality make. We're facing that in our own country here. Tokenism is real, it is universal. And if we appreciate that it takes really getting to the root of privilege, be that material privilege, social privilege, whatever. And in Cuba now, yeah, I agree with Paige, it's definitely heading more towards that re-stratification socioeconomically because of the tourism industry. And I think if we don't work with the Cubans to kind of let them know that that doesn't necessarily have to be the road that they have to go down, it'll be better all across the board.
And one huge things are tips, and we haven't talked about that. Tourism is bringing a lot of tips, and they are very meaningful. When a Cuban, the average is $20 per month, and an American comes and leaves $2 after the dinner. And then they have seen, I haven't studied this, but I have heard in my trips to Cuba that people is studying just tourism now. So all doctors, you see a doctor driving a taxi because it gives him more revenue. So people that work in tourism, they have more money.
And just to contextualize that financial thing, inside of the dual economy, it's 24 national pesos for every one Cuban convertible peso, or CUC as we call it. So to leave a $2 tip, that is 48 national pesos. That's, let's see.
That's half month.
3 months?
What?
No, that's like around half a month. No. I don't
No,
know.
I was going to put it in terms of like maneuvering throughout the streets. That, you know, gets you 4 moto rides, taxi rides. That gets you lunch for a week. You know, it's a lot. But and so that disparity is also creating even more disparity.
How's that going to relate to the crime level as it is right now?
Yeah, I mean, when I say crime level, it's like it isn't. There are no guns out on the streets in Cuba. Let's be clear. I feel safer in Cuba than I do anywhere in the world. I'm talking about, you know, casual break-ins and theft of material items. Occasionally, someone will get robbed in the street. You hear about that, and it's definitely increased as the thirst for material items has come back.
Well, and as people haven't been provided things by the government. I mean, I think it's both of those things, because they're no longer getting what they need, even just in terms of living, you know, just basic food and things. So, and they don't, if you work for the government, you don't have enough money to get those things either. And so there's a big black market economy, a parallel economy, and there is more crime.
And that's part of the updating model. So that's also in response to what will happen when there are not these material items. We need to take the black market from out of the shadows and allow people to legitimately and legally run these businesses that they're already running. So the government and the people are looking to respond to these issues that we're bringing up, so that they can continue to, you know, move forward with the project that is Cuba.
Now, I must say, there's one point in terms of the government withholding resources. I was last there in 2013. That was a year after Hurricane Sandy hit Santiago, and Hurricane Sandy hurt Santiago exceptionally bad. The hurricane came in, and because of the mountains, and I'm sure now because of the coral reefs eroding, it just stayed inside of Santiago as a big hole, like geographic hole, and just ripped them apart for hours throughout the night. And people, it was still so raw in the living memory, people couldn't talk about it. They were also complaining about how a year had passed and they didn't have the resources that were donated to rebuild the city. And so that was what I was left with. Now, this is a great example of people-to-people exchange. When the Santiago de Cuba All-Star dancers came a couple months ago, I sat down with them because they live in the community that I study. And I asked them, you know, some updates, how people were, and then how, you know, kind of the landscape looked in terms of rebuilding after the hurricane. And they said, oh, everything's beautiful. You know, all the resources were released. People were able to reconstruct their houses. The buildings were rebuilt. New buildings were built, and not in the Soviet manner, which let no air passage throughout, but more adaptable to the conditions on the island. And they said, you know, things look so pretty now. And so over the last couple weeks, because of the 500-year anniversary of Santiago, tourism videos have been released. And so I've been able to see that, plus other images that from contacts that I know. And it is true. Like, the government did release those resources. The city is being rebuilt. It does look beautiful. Now, there are definitely politics involved, but I don't want to leave the impression that the government just withholds everything. They have actually made...
Sometimes they do.
Yeah, sometimes they do, but they have made a productive effort in this case.
So, Ximena, you specifically addressed this, but I think that all of you can speak to it regarding the strong laws. And I'm curious, especially based on my experience and relative to other Latin American countries and Caribbean nations, what you see as the enforcement of those strong laws, because certainly there can be strong laws on paper and poor enforcement, or just the opposite. So I'm curious to see what you think of that presently and where you see it going.
So I can start with environmental laws. So currently, tourism makes a huge change in enforcement. Gardens of the Queen is so successful because there is a strong presence of a tourism there. It's a company with it's the Italian government in partnership with it's an Italian company in partnership with Cuban government. And Gardens of the Queen is big, it's 1,000 square kilometers, and it is enforced mainly by this tourism company. So as I see it, is that we need to support those laws, those environmental laws on the tourism development. We have to see it as an advantage and not as a threat. And we need to work with the law in order for those tourism to be committed to give funding to conservation and enforcement. So that's from the environmental perspective, environmental law.
As far as, I think, two good examples of enforcement and strong laws would be the laws for the entrepreneurs, the cuenta propistas, and then the foreign investment laws. So with the entrepreneur laws, it's, as I said, it's part of a larger economic updating model, and they're very committed to making sure that those who are newly self-employed or who've been self-employed for a while but it's been illegal, that they get the assistance that they need to actually do what it is that they have to do. It's also, the labor code has been changed, and it's a little, because entities can now hire Cubans as employees, which was not possible before because the state was the only employer. So an entity, a cooperative, could hire people, or a person, an entrepreneur, could hire other employees. So there are going to be issues that are going to arise there that, yes, there are going to be issues that arise there that are going to have to be dealt with, and I think that they're on the path of making sure that that happens. As far as foreign direct investment, the foreign direct investment laws, that's another area where people have concern about if those regulations are going to be upheld. There's a lot of, the language of the law does protect the assets and protects the investors who are coming in, but of course people are concerned because in the past, things have been nationalized. So, but I do believe that because of the changes that Cuban people and the Cuban government want, they're putting the proper force behind the laws that they're saying will help the country move forward.
Well, okay, we had a question
in the middle.
Okay,
Last question?
we had
Yeah.
one here too. So okay.
Is there more?
Sorry,
Okay.
yes, just quickly. Yes, sir. Okay, all right, okay, great.
Okay.
Julie.
Yeah, I'm just curious, as I mentioned last night, as a Canadian, I've been traveling freely in Cuba for decades now. And one of the things that's amazing is how educated the Cubans are. And it's true that doctors are working in the tourism industry, and not only doctors, but doctors who have learned second and third languages. What is the state of the education system right now? I mean, the public education, and how is that being thought of or not thought of as a strength in terms of building bridges with the United States?
I can take that one.
You want to do both together?
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. Great.
I guess we were in Cuba a couple of years ago, and there was an indication that the Chinese were coming in to work in the harbors, Havana and others, making a lot of direct investment. To what extent do you think the Chinese may be seeking to replace the Soviets as far as an influential partner with Cuba in competition with the United States?
Okay. Well, I can actually address both of those questions, at least in part. First, in terms of the state education system, right now Cuba is, whenever, as a young graduate student, we interacted with Cuban undergrads, we were always blown away at how much more theory they knew than us. They know all of the European intellectual thinkers backwards and forwards. this history of philosophy that I go to, the seminar that I go to whenever I'm in Havana, always brings absolutely tremendously valuable information as to how they conceptualize civil society and engaging those ideas, because part of what being a Cuban citizen, part of the revolution, a fundamental tenet of the revolution was to say, humans, it is a human right to have education. It is a human right to be literate. To deny that is to violate people's humanity. So as a tenet of the revolution, if we provide every individual the ability to read, to educate themselves, to do research themselves, then they are living up to their ultimate human potential. And that's been a central tenet of their educational system. Now, like I said earlier, and like Kasara said, Cuba does live inside of some contradictions. When you get into like Cuban intellectual thought, it is very much tied to the United States and to Euro-Western knowledge production, with the ties to kind of Malinowski and how they conceptualize culture and those dichotomies that are imbued within racialization. And so right now, as Cuba is moving forward and as Cuba has kept social solidarity ties across various liberation movements throughout the world, they are in the process of revamping the information that is distributed to be more inclusive and not just tout a particular line of what happened in Havana as what happened throughout the island. And that does mean being more inclusive in terms of inserting African descendants into the historical narrative and conceptual narrative. And they are also very much so maintaining the educational system. And the educational system, that's another lecture in and of itself, in terms of how that's structured and the way that professions are selected, et cetera. But in terms of what is the current state of the education system, they are kind of reconceptualizing broader inclusivity in terms of the historical narratives, as well as the skill sets provided. In terms of the Chinese presence, China and the U.S. China and Cuba have had a relationship in terms of providing labor, physical manual labor, since the 1830s, when Chinese were forcibly brought to Cuba supposedly as indentured labor, but actually fit into the old plantation slavery system that Africans had previously occupied and still did. Again, the historical contextualization of that in terms of the abolishment of the slave trade and all of the fights going on is a whole other lecture in and of itself. There's a fantastic book called The Chinese in Cuba, A Transnational History by Kathleen Lopez that gives a really fantastic insight from history to contemporary in terms of the different waves of China, the Chinese presence. In terms of the contemporary relationship economically, having seen the Chinese enter, having seen them provide workers, having seen the Cubans' response to the Chinese workers, I don't believe that they are looking to replace the USSR. Cuba is very cognizant of the relationship with China as part of their identity, and the Chinese are not necessarily wanting to be there. They kind of keep to themselves, and it's not that kind of partnership relationship that Cuba seemingly had with the USSR, but rather they're providing services, they're providing material resources, they're providing electronics, buses were a big thing, and then they are providing workers to help the Cubans learn how to manage those material goods because they can't read the manuals in Chinese.
But they're putting a lot of direct foreign investment, not only in the harbors, but in the drilling, the oil off the shores, and since the Cuban government doesn't have any money, I think there's going to be an influence of those funds on the Cuban-Chinese relationship as against ours, unless we somehow compensate on our side.
Well, I would disagree. I mean, I'm sure that is definitely a reality, but I think Cuba has and will do what it wants to do to maintain its social order in its light. They've always been in that modality. They were the same when the Russians were there. There are a lot of alternative histories to the Cuban Missile Crisis that I would recommend people seek out because it's not necessarily the narrative that has been propagated in the United States. I would say the same relationship applies to Cuba and China right now. Cuba doesn't want to be under anyone else. They want to do their own thing. They always have.
They're not going to create the same sort of relationship, but I do think that there is the concern that the power follows money. So if China's the only or the biggest player, the United States is not, then of course that's going to create a certain relationship. But Cuba is not looking to be subsidized in the way that they were subsidized by the USSR, because when that collapses, then they collapse. They're looking to figure out how to have a sustainable economy and work on their own. And I think just very quickly with education, I don't know if this is what you're getting at, but it's always, underneath their model, what they're proposing, it's always going to be free. It's always going to be a tenant. There isn't necessarily the same money that's flowing into the institutions. There are people who have access to cooks, who are getting tutors for their children because the education system is not the same, but what they want to do is to continue to move forward and have free education and make it a better system. They're not looking to change it to a different model. So it's about bringing the money in, and so that's where all these other changes come in.
A quick word on education, scientists. When you think scientists, right now, I grew up in Colombia, and now I had the opportunity to come here. That's a huge opportunity. And to have internet, we as scientists, we research all the time in the internet. Internet is very limited in Cuba. So that's a challenge. But even though they are the best, like the best scientists, and we work with them, and they give us insights from their experience in education, and they are excellent. But what we can bring is modeling, for example, that technology with the computers that we have. For example, every time I go, I have my USB with all the papers of science and things like that. So there are ways to do it, but I just want to point out that internet, I think, is a huge subject in education for scientists because it's very important for them.
And technology is one of the places of trade that's actually open to U.S. Citizens. So.
Okay, we've reached the end of our time. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here.
I want to also thank all of our panelists here, Alexandra, Ximena, Kasara, and Paige. Thank you all. Another stimulating discussion, and I know many of you might want to follow up with them, and I encourage you to do so.